We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast.
Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. So we talk a lot about energy democracy on Energy Changemakers. The concept of households and businesses sharing wealth and ownership of energy, particularly electric power. There are two main ways people discuss achieving this greater energy democracy. One is what's referred to as a bottom-up approach, which is advocated by grid architect Lorenzo Christoph. In that scenario, you build as much local energy as possible, and then after that, you build large-scale power plants and transmission, which is sort of the opposite way of how the electric grid is built now. Now, what we do is we fulfill forecasted power demand by building large infrastructure and then just sort of filling in the distributed energy or local energy in almost a haphazard way afterward. You can learn more about Lorenzo's thinking by listening to the Energy Changemakers August 28, 2024 podcast, Are We Expecting Too Much from Virtual Power Plants? A second approach to energy democracy involves restructuring the utility system to provide more public control, something more akin to public power for the entire country. We're very fortunate today to have as our guest Sandeep Vaheesan, legal director at Open Markets Institute, who recently published a book called Democracy in Power, A History of Electrification in the United States. And I highly recommend it to anyone interested in issues surrounding energy democracy. It achieves the oh-so-difficult balance of being highly readable, but also providing the depth energy insiders seek. Welcome, Sandeep. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Elisa. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well deserved. I know you put a lot of work into this book, and it shows. It's great. I like the book a lot. It was an eye-opener for me. I thought you did a tremendous amount of research, and you provide some striking stories about how some of today's utilities are acting in not very democratic ways that are harming consumers. But before we get into some of those stories, let me ask you, what made you decide to write a book about energy democracy?
I worked on the power sector and energy policy more broadly for almost 20 years now, and the bulk of that time was focused on investor-owned utilities, so private power. I was involved with rate cases, I was involved with mergers and acquisitions, I was involved with some of the restructuring that was going on in the early and mid-2000s. And I came to public and cooperative power fairly recently. I dipped my toes into this important part of the sector in 2019. I was invited to write a short post about public power's role in addressing climate change. And up till that point, I knew very little about public power and cooperative power. I knew there were rural electric cooperatives. I knew there was a thing in the South called the Tennessee Valley Authority, but I didn't know much beyond that. So I spent a couple of weeks writing this blog post, which was 1,000 words, maybe 1,200 words. And at the end of my research, I realized there's a fascinating history here. Public power used to be the stuff of popular politics. Candidates ran on the cause of public power. National, state, local figures made their names on this issue. But the history, as far as I could tell, had largely been forgotten. Journalists, scholars stopped writing about it in a major way sometime in the 60s or 70s. And so I thought to myself, if I'm ever fortunate enough to write a book, I'd like to tell the story again. How did we get nearly 1,000 rural electric cooperatives? How did we get the nation's largest publicly owned utility, the TVA? And how might we learn from this history and pursue a more public approach to addressing climate change? And I was lucky enough to get the chance to write a book about a year later when an editor at the University of Chicago Press by the name of Chad Zimmerman reached out and asked if I would like to work with him on a book. I enthusiastically said yes and told him I actually have a topic in mind. So that's the genesis of this book.
Well, you happened on a very timely topic, I think. It's being discussed more and more. And it's being discussed more and more because of discontent with the private utility system. In your view, what's wrong with the current utility system?
I think the basic problem with our present system is most power customers in the United States, around 75%, are served by what are called investor-owned utilities, formerly called public utilities, but the public aspect of these institutions tends to be fairly weak and in some cases secondary. Shareholders and their elected boards and managers are in charge of these institutions, making decisions to advance shareholder interests, whether that's seeking aggressive rate increases, cutting corners on maintenance, or failing to invest enough in renewable and other forms of clean energy. So there's a basic tension here. We have public utilities that are structured to serve the public, provide just and reasonable rates, a high level of reliability. But those public goals are subordinated to shareholder goals, which tend to focus on maximizing revenue, reducing costs to generate, no pun intended, dividends, as well as funds to support things like stock buyback. So there's a basic tension at the heart of the investor-owned utility. And in most instances, when shareholders are facing the public, shareholders win.
Yeah.
The decision makers inside the utility answer to shareholders, not to the public. They're well organized. They retain the most expensive lawyers and lobbyists. So this basic conflict is why there's so much discontent over rates, utility debt, reliability, and of course, failure to make progress in decarbonizing the power sector.
Mhm. Yeah, very good point. It's like investor-owned utilities are trying to serve two masters, and the master that happens to be the consumer seems to be the one that often loses out because it is such a complex system. And as you pointed out, there's regulatory capture, and
Right.
they have the money to go in there and deal with the complexities of a rate case that the consumer just doesn't have. Even though there's attempts to do that through consumer advocates and whatnot, it's just, they're just not up to the fight. They don't have that kind of money, and for the most part.
That's exactly right. And, public service commissions were set up more than a century ago to represent consumers and the general public. But more often than not, these institutions serve as arbitrators mediating disputes between very powerful financial interests and unorganized consumer interests. And this has been a persistent problem. You can go back to the 1920s and 30s. You can read speeches by Franklin Delano Roosevelt where he's saying they're supposed to be agents of the public. Instead, they're acting like neutral judges. And that's a real problem. And it's a problem we really haven't solved.
Very good point. So that's why people are looking more and more at public power. But as we've seen many times, it's really hard to move the system from private investor-owned utility to public utility. One of the most notable recent cases was the referendum in Maine last year, an attempt to buy out the private utility companies and create a statewide customer-owned electric system. That failed, and many other smaller efforts on the municipal level to create public power systems we also see often fail. We have a lot of them out there now that are operating, but creating new ones is very, very difficult. And it's because private utilities pour a lot of money into obstructing them. One thing I found fascinating about your book is you're not just saying, hey, let's do public utilities and everything will be great. You point out that there can be some problems with the municipal utilities as well, if not done correctly. Tell us some of those stories. I was particularly interested in the Rappahannock Electric Cooperative in Virginia because I happen to live in Virginia. Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, so you hit on a really critical theme. There's nothing inherently virtuous about public ownership. Simply taking a utility into public hands doesn't guarantee lower rates, better service, more rapid action on climate change. So institutional design matters, And we see it quite powerfully at both publicly owned utilities and cooperative utilities. And the example you mentioned, I think, is a really damning example of how institutional design done wrong can create utilities that are nominally controlled by their community, but in practice are controlled by the people on the inside, the boards and the managers. So you mentioned Rappahannock Electric Cooperative, which serves a large swath of territory in Northern Virginia, just outside of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. I believe it's the second largest rural electric cooperative in the nation. And it's been plagued by governance problems. At a basic level, the board has refused to hold open monthly meetings where customers can show up and express their views, either positive or negative. Similarly, the board refuses to make financial statements easily accessible. I believe they've made some progress there, but for years they refused to make the books open. And maybe most damning of all is they don't have honest elections. And let me give you some detail on how the elections are not honest. So cooperatives in rural electric cooperatives hold annual board meetings where a subset of the board is up for election. Usually board members have 2 or 4-year terms. Every year, some fraction of board members are up for election. And the election typically happens at an annual board meeting where the cooperative invites everyone in the service territory to show up, vote for new board members, and meet other members of the cooperative customer base. All sounds good on paper, grassroots democracy in action. The reality is, in most places, member turnout tends to be very low. If 10% of members show up, it's considered a success among rural electric cooperatives. And what Rappahannock did was, recognizing this, they said, okay, we will let members give their family members and friends who show up their proxy vote. It sounds good on paper. I might not be able to attend due to family obligations, or maybe I work in the evenings. And so I can give my neighbor my proxy and say, hey, John, please attend the board meeting and cast a vote for yourself as well as for me. That sounds fine in principle. What the board at Rappahannock did was they said you had to designate your proxy in advance. We'll send you a proxy statement and designate who your proxy is, and that person will be allowed to cast their vote for you. So far, so good. The slippery thing they did is they said, if proxy statements are returned blank, we will treat them as a designation of your proxy to us, to the board itself. And what they did was they said, return your proxy statement and you'll be entered in a lottery to win a prize.
So it's an incentive, not
an incentive,
yeah.
Exactly. And it's something pretty attractive, so people could win an iPad or a gadget like that, something that everyone would like to have. And so in most years, what happens is, a few people actually designate their proxy to someone they know, but the board gets thousands of blank proxy statements. And so the board is collecting thousands of votes for itself. And so in recent elections, what we've seen is ordinary people running to be on the board, knocking doors, sending out mailers, saying, I want to serve on the board. I want the board to take climate more seriously. I want them to think more carefully about rate design, maybe restructure rates to promote efficient use of energy, to promote conservation. And some of these candidates have done quite well, winning the votes of actual members. But then the board has, in several instances, said, we don't want this person on the board. They're going to be difficult. They're going to disrupt how we've been doing things for the past several decades. So we're going to allot our proxies to the person we like, who may have come in second or third or fourth, and put them over the top. And so they're making a mockery of cooperative democracy. They are manipulating elections, abusing the proxy system to prevent candidates that they find objectionable from running and actually winning. So at this point, people feel as though running as a serious challenger is a fruitless activity because the board will simply use its proxies to select the candidate that it wants.
It's a stacked game, it seems.
It's a stacked game, and it's frankly really egregious. I was appalled when I first heard about this. because cooperatives, including rural electric cooperatives, talk a lot about small d democracy, how they're controlled by their members. And here you have a big rural electric cooperative flouting one of the basic principles of cooperative enterprise.
Incredible. And you had several other examples in your book of utilities that I'd say behave in ways that are less than ideal for consumers. Which stories sort of stand out in your mind in particular?
So I think one story that stands out is from South Carolina, and this is the Tri-County Electric Cooperative, which serves an area outside of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. It's a relatively small electric cooperative, and what was happening here was the board was really treating the cooperative as their personal fiefdom. What they were doing was they created a nominations committee to determine who would appear on the annual ballot, and the nominations committee was stacked with family and friends of current board members. The board had been in power for decades, and the chair of the board, a man by the name of Heap Hill, was in absolute control of this institution. Many employees of the cooperative said, this is not a cooperative, this is actually Hill Electric, because he has absolute control over this institution that's supposedly controlled by its customers. And I'll highlight a few things that I found especially outrageous. So being a cooperative board as a general matter is a pretty easy job. Many people who are retired or semi-retired run for cooperative board to get a supplemental income. They're not actually expected to do very much. And in Tri-County, what was happening is the board members were abusing the per diem process. Basically, cooperative rules said for every day of cooperative work, board members were entitled to a per diem. And they were cooking the books on when they actually showed up. So members would say, we did work on this day and that day, but they actually didn't do anything. They might have had a perfunctory meeting or phone call, but they didn't actually tend to cooperative business.
Okay.
And by abusing this per diem policy, some of the board members were making $50,000, $60,000 a year for a do-nothing job. In one instance, a board member was so sloppy that she tried to claim a per diem for February 30th, which is a day that doesn't exist even on leap years. And so the board was enriching itself. Further, they were awarding themselves and friends and family either discounted or free service. So might offer a line extension on a rural property or a farm at no cost or at token cost. So it was fairly egregious conduct. And from the customer's perspective, they were paying among the highest rates in the state of South Carolina, rates that were significantly higher than what customers of IOUs were paying. And the good news is there was actually a member revolt in 2017, I believe it was 17, following some really good investigative reporting by a local journalist saying the board is running this community-owned institution as a personal fiefdom, getting rich while charging the customers among the highest rates in the state. And so once this was brought to light, the cooperative's members said, enough is enough. We can't believe this has gone on for so long. And so they ended up throwing out the incumbent board, voting in an all-new board that was much more representative of the community that the cooperative serves. One brief aside I should mention is rural electric cooperatives are heavily concentrated in the South and the Midwest.
Mhm.
And in many places in the South, these cooperatives are serving predominantly Black communities. But in spite of that, many cooperatives still have all-white boards. So you have a very diverse customer base served by a cooperative that has an entirely unrepresentative board. People have said many cooperatives are controlled by these old boy networks. There's a very clubby, chummy atmosphere where they say this is our institution and view member participation, member interest in the cooperative as an annoyance, as an intrusion on their prerogatives. So what happened in Tri-County is there was a member revolt, new board took over, and I think this shows that if things get sufficiently bad at cooperatives, there is this latent democracy where members can take things into their own hands, kick out the crooks, and vote in an honest representative board. Obviously, it shouldn't have come to this. The cooperative shouldn't have been this badly governed, but there was a happy ending in a sense in that members exercised their democratic control and reasserted their power.
So, as I mentioned, at Energy Changemakers, we talk a lot about a bottom-up approach to energy democracy, one that emphasizes the development of local distributed energy first. You have a different kind of vision. So we've pointed out so far, like what the problems are with the investor-owned utility, what can be the problems with public power, but you see a way forward here. Talk about your vision.
Yeah, so you describe one vision, which is very much bottom up, start at a small scale and build from there. So it can be distributed energy, whether rooftop solar or community solar. Start there and then build up toward utility scale generation and transmission projects. My vision, which by no means is in conflict or even in tension with what you articulate, is scale matters in power systems. If we want the lights to be on 24/7, if we want electricity to remain an on-demand service, certain things need to be done at scale. So I see real advantages in having regional grids. We should be working toward a national grid where we can take advantage of diversities in climate. It might not be sunny in one place, but it might be sunny 100 miles away. So as we transition toward intermittent renewable resources, I think scale becomes even more important. And then on the load side, different places have peak demand at different times of day, different seasons in the year. So I think doing generation and transmission at a large scale makes a lot of sense. It's been a defining feature of the American power sector for more than 100 years now. So my book is not so much about breaking down size, turning large units into smaller units. It's about who's in charge of these large units, whether we're talking about the regional transmission grid, wholesale power markets, or large-scale generation facilities, whether it's solar, wind, or nuclear. And in my book, I try to make the case that we have a template for managing these large-scale resources in a democratic way. As we just discussed, democracy doesn't always exist in practice, but formally speaking, about 1 in 4 customers in the United States is served by what's called a consumer-owned power system. And that means either a publicly owned utility or a cooperative utility. And so my vision is, how do we perfect what we have? How do we improve governance, address some of the serious misgovernance that we've seen, and expand this model going forward to address climate change, but then also expand economic democracy in an important part of the economy. So that's my vision. It's much more focused on converting shareholder-controlled institutions into publicly controlled institutions, and in some cases actually doing things on an even larger scale than what we do now. Just to briefly expand on that, in the United States, we have a fairly fragmented grid. We have some connections between utility systems, some limited interconnections between regions, let's say the Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest. But I think there's a good argument to be made that we should be working toward a integrated national grid where we can actually move large quantities of, let's say, low-cost wind power from the Great Plains to big cities. You can imagine transmission lines running from western Kansas, western Nebraska, east to the Twin Cities, Chicago, maybe even all the way to the East Coast. And so my vision is about how do we do this in a democratic way and ensure real popular control over these critical systems.
Right. I don't think these two models are in conflict. One is talking about building from the bottom up, making sure you first have as much supply that's local as is possible, because for many reasons, but one is simply the efficiency of having power generated near where it's used. But like you said, the large systems are also necessary.
Right.
And so what you're talking about is kind of like, okay, now let's look at these large systems and how are they governed?
Exactly. And I think done right, these are very much complementary and mutually reinforcing systems. Because as you say, generating power at the local level on a small scale can have important resiliency benefits. We saw the massive blackout in Spain and Portugal earlier this week. And you can imagine a future where, thanks in significant measure to climate change, where such events become more frequent and intense. But if we build up microgrids, we can limit the fallout from such systemic failures. We might be able to keep the lights on in many places, even as a regional or national grid experiences serious disruptions.
Exactly. So let's go back to the idea of having more public control over the system. What are some ways that the public can exercise more control over its utilities?
The clearest but most difficult way is through municipalization campaigns, where a city or other locality takes over an existing investor-owned utility and operates it as a public agency. We talked about the referendum in Maine in 2023, which was unsuccessful. The initiative was defeated by a margin of, I believe, about 70 to 30. So this is the clearest way in which the public can exercise greater control over power systems, but it's also one of the most difficult ways, given the fierce resistance from incumbent IOUs who stand to lose a lot if they are taken into public hands. So that's one option. And I think an option that's increasing in salience, more states and localities are talking about municipalization, other public ownership efforts as a serious and credible alternative to what we have now. But besides that, I think there are other ways. I think one important way is attend meetings of the Public Service Commission. These are relatively neglected parts of government. Most people might not even know that they have a Public Service Commission that's supposed to represent the consumer interest when it comes to electricity and gas service. And people are allowed to attend meetings, weigh in on rate cases, either through verbal or written testimony. So following Public Service Commission proceedings is a modest, but I think good way for members of the public to get involved. And if more people get involved, I think the Public Service Commission, that at present might be rubber stamping everything presented to it by the IOU, might start to think, okay, the public's starting to take notice. We might have to be more vigilant in carrying out our duties going forward. Could also call on state legislatures to increase funding for public service commissions. In many places, these are badly under-resourced agencies. You may have dedicated leadership, certainly dedicated staff, but they just don't have the resources to do a good job reviewing rates, regulating standards of service. So increasing budgets can be very beneficial in the short and medium term. In places that elect public service commission boards, more people should run for these positions. They have a lot of latent power, and with public-spirited people in charge, they can do a lot of good, both on rates as well as on climate, and see some good examples of that recently, where public service commissions have cracked down on utilities' efforts to recover lobbying costs from ratepayers. They've said, well, if you're going to spend money on dues to trade associations, that's going to come out of shareholders' pockets, not customers' pockets. So I think there's real potential for public service commissions to do good, but first we need the public to pay attention.
Right. Such a good point. We actually did a podcast a week or two ago with a group called Powerlines, and they're a fairly new organization, and their goal is basically to help the public understand how they can get involved and also to create situations where it's easier for them. So, like they're advocating for things like having public service commission meetings during times of day or week where people can actually attend. So I think there's a lot here that can go on. And your point is really good too about the lack of funding for public service commission. They're both called public service commissions and public utilities commissions. So I may be using those terms interchangeably. But yeah, it's a bit like taking a knife to a gunfight, because these commissions, even if they are diligent, really trying to do a good job, they don't have anywhere near the resources of some of the really big utilities that are coming in there and making their case. So it's a difficult situation.
Exactly. And they're also operating in a challenging political environment where in most places, the investor-owned utility has a great deal of political power. They have a lot of clout in the legislature, in the courts.
They give a lot of money to campaigns.
A lot of money to campaigns. So the public service commissioners are worried about, first getting reversed on appeal. Their decisions are subject to judicial review, and the courts in many places are very friendly to business interests. That's one risk. And then the legislature can also be a real political threat to public-minded PSCs or PUCs, because, as you say, elected members are getting significant campaign donations from utilities, and if the utilities feel like that the PSC is being too hard on them, they'll complain to their legislators and say, these guys are out of control. You need to rein in their statutory powers, maybe cut their funding. So when the public is disengaged, you have a really, really one-sided fight. I think you're absolutely right. Maybe not even a knife to a gunfight, but maybe more like a fork or spoon to a gunfight.
Plastic fork or spoon.
Plastic fork or spoon. And so right now it's hard even for dedicated staff and commissioners to take on these interests, which are often the most powerful interests in their state. But that changes if members of the public get involved, if the local press starts paying attention, scrutinizes decision-making of the utility and the Public Service Commission. Then you're talking about a less uneven fight. Then you're talking about people versus money. And this is not to say that people are going to win every time. Certainly not that confident, but we have the chance of winning a significant fraction of the time.
Interesting. In a conversation we had, you said we could use the public sector to give private utilities a good hard kick in the pants. Tell us what you meant by that.
So this idea draws heavily from a speech Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave in Portland, Oregon in 1932, where this was before he was elected. This was in September, so 2 months before the election. He articulated his vision for the power sector and what he would do if elected. And one thing he makes very clear early in the speech is he does not support full nationalization of the power sector. He actually goes out of his way to say, I believe private ownership should remain the rule. I believe in the potential of public service regulation. Here are some ways I would try to improve it if I become president. So in some ways, a very conservative speech. But then he says, I believe in the idea of yardstick competition. So he says, I want the federal government to build dams in the four corners of the United States on the Columbia, Colorado, St. Lawrence, and Tennessee rivers, dams that would generate large quantities of low-cost hydroelectricity. And his view is the public sector, through direct competition with the private sector, as well as through the power of publicity, can force the private sector to do better on rates, reliability, and other terms and conditions of service. And what he's really saying is the public sector can play an important regulatory function. Not only would federal dams increase the supply of electricity in the United States, the public sector would discipline the private sector. In a sense, the private sector would always be looking over its shoulder and saying, well, the public sector is coming for us. We need to keep up with them. So he articulated this vision of public-private competition in service of the public interest. And the third part of this yardstick idea was probably the most radical aspect, was what he called the birch rod. He said at the distribution level, cities and other local governments should have the right to buy out their investor-owned utility and operate it as a publicly owned institution. And he called us the birch rod because he used this rather dated metaphor where he says, we need to discipline these IOUs, and some of them are behaving like spoiled children who can only be reformed through the use of the birch rod in the cupboard. So he's, appealing to corporal punishment. It's not a metaphor we'd want our politicians to use today, but I think it captured the basic idea. And he says if the threat of public takeover is credible, that will be enough to get good service in most instances. In a sense, the private utility will be so afraid of the public takeover that they will adopt a quasi-public orientation.
And the problem now is it's not a credible alternative. It's not credible that they will come in and take over because it's so hard.
Exactly. So formally speaking, in most states, the birch rod is an option, but it's so difficult to exercise that the investor-owned utilities don't view it as a serious threat. The process is very time-consuming, and there are many methods by which the private utility can gum up the process and prevent municipalization.
Exactly. So we've beat up on the utilities quite a bit so far, but there are some good things happening out there. So, and you talk about them in the book. Well, what are some examples of utilities or public power entities that are getting it right?
I'll name a couple and then maybe talk about one very live and interesting fight that's happening. So in the course of researching this book, I did some fairly deep research on the power system of the Pacific Northwest, which is heavily public, especially in Washington state. And the reason is the federal government built a number of large dams on the Columbia River, which is the river that has the most hydroelectric potential of any river in North America, and created this large federal power system that serves Washington, Oregon, and parts of Montana and Idaho. The Grand Coulee Dam, which is still the largest power plant in the U.S., is a part of this system. And what's interesting about the federal power system out there is it was reformed substantially in the late 1970s to be much more accountable to the public. So the relevant institutional actor is the Bonneville Power Administration, which was responsible for marketing and transmitting power from roughly 30 dams of the Pacific Northwest. And in the Northwest Power Act of 1980, Congress restructured the BPA. What it did was, on one hand, it gave BPA the power to contract for new generation resources. So demand for electricity had grown rapidly in the Pacific Northwest between the 1930s and the 1970s. The hydroelectric system was largely built out. There weren't good sites that were still undeveloped in the 1970s. And so BPA was facing this crisis of, well, how are we going to meet demand in 1985 or 1990? And so Congress gave it the authority to go into the market and contract for new generation capacity. At the same time, Congress said, going forward, you need to be much more accountable and answerable to the people of the Pacific Northwest. So Congress mandated extensive public participation requirements for both rate setting as well as resource planning, and then also created a special agency called the Northwest Power Council, which has 2 representatives from each of the 4 states of the Pacific Northwest, appointed by the governor of each of the states. And this council plays a central role in resource planning, figuring out, well, what's demand going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and how are we going to meet that demand? And one interesting thing that Congress did in the Northwest Power Act, which in many ways was a law way ahead of its time, was Congress said, yes, you can go out and obtain a new generation resources to meet demand. But first, you must figure out whether you can reduce demand over time through conservation efficiency.
Very nice.
So Congress said, think of demand-side measures. Demand-side measures is a term we use today. They didn't necessarily use the term back then, but Congress said, think of demand-side measures as an alternative to supply. Focus on that, get all that you can out of it, and if you're still expecting load growth, then go contract for a wind farm or geothermal plant. And so BPA in many respects is public not just in form, but in function. For instance, on rate setting, BPA is required to publish a proposed rate schedule, take public comment on it, hold public hearings where utilities, customers, Native American tribes can all show up, express their views. And I single out Native American tribes because the federal power system in the Pacific Northwest was extremely destructive to the fish stocks, specifically the salmon stocks of the Columbia River and its tributaries. And these are fish stocks that Native peoples had relied on for millennia. And so one thing Congress tried to do in the Northwest Power Act was, in a sense, make amends to the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest and recognize, okay, we committed a great wrong against you. We cannot undo that wrong, but we will try to do better going forward and make fish and wildlife protection a part of federal resource planning out here. So BPA in many ways is a good model. It's a model I believe we should try to replicate in other parts of the country. One of their wholesale customers is the Eugene Water and Electric Board, which is a publicly owned utility serving the people of Eugene, Oregon. I believe in many ways it's a model of energy democracy. The utility is governed by a 5-member elected board. Board seats are regularly contested. Challengers have won elections in recent times. People show up at open monthly meetings to express their views. The meetings tend not to be well attended for the most part, but when the issue of rates or resources come up, people show up, express their opinions, share their expertise. So this utility, which is called EWEB for short, really exemplifies good governance, accountable governance. And if we're looking for a public distribution model to copy elsewhere, I think EWEB is a great one to copy. Last but not least, I'll briefly mention an interesting fight that's happening in New York State right now around the publicly owned New York Power Authority. About 2 years ago, the New York legislature gave the New York Power Authority, or NYPA, the authority to build large-scale renewable resources. And New York has rather aggressive climate legislation. The utilities in the state must get to net zero by 2040. And as of now, they're not on track to achieve that objective. And so what the New York legislature said is, since the private sector is not investing nearly enough in renewable energy, why don't we do it directly through a public agency? And so NYPA now has this power. And the fight at the moment is, how much is NYPA going to build? So many members of the legislature, many climate advocates are saying NYPA really needs to go big. Private power developers have not built enough. So many of their projects have ended up dying on the vine due to interconnection issues, due to financing issues, due to technical issues. Given this recent record, we want NYPA to take the lead in decarbonizing the state's power industry. There's one camp saying, let's be really aggressive. Let's put the public sector at the forefront of decarbonization. Unfortunately, the leader of NYPA, a man by the name of Justin Driscoll, is taking a much more cautious approach. He is still counting on the private sector to lead decarbonization in New York. He put out a report in January admitting, many of these private renewable projects have failed to materialize. But then at the same time, saying, well, I believe they'll do better going forward. And his view of NYPA's new authority is NYPA should do just enough to fill in the gaps between what the private sector is proposing to build and what New York state law requires. So it's a much more reactive, conservative approach. But the fight isn't over by any means. I think Driscoll proposed to build around 3 gigawatts of renewable energy. The climate justice camp is saying NYPA should do 15 gigawatts, so about 5 times as much. So there's a pretty big gap there. But Driscoll encouragingly said 3 gigawatts is just a first step. We're open to building more going forward. And a number of legislators and organizers in New York are keeping the pressure up on Driscoll because they recognize the fight's not easy. Driscoll is not on their side, but he recognizes that he's facing a lot of scrutiny and pressure.
So that's a TBA story. We'll be watching that one. Interesting.
Yes, it's a story to watch with care and interest.
Yeah. One thing you said in the book, I'm just going to quote the book here. It's very well written, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
The organizing, advocacy, struggles, and achievements in recent times could be the early innings of a third major push for public power in the United States. The first happening at the turn of the 20th century, and the second during the 20-year window that began with FDR's inauguration in 1933. So I want to ask you then, what is it about now that makes public power a greater likelihood? What's happening? What is it about this time?
So I think at least 2 things are happening. The first is there's growing frustration and anger about utility rates. Millions of people are struggling to pay their monthly power bills. And there's a common and I believe correct view that the rates and bills are too damn high. So there's this real grassroots frustration with the utility status quo.
So part of it's we're at a point of pain right now. And that point of pain could get worse, correct? Because we're looking at the potential for data centers to require a lot of power and require a lot of building of new generation, which could require the construction of more transmission and distribution, and a lot of concern out there that this is going to drive up the consumer's bill even more.
That's exactly right. Load is starting to grow again after, I think, 20 or 25 years of relative stagnation in load growth. And there's a risk that these costs of new generation of new infrastructure will be socialized broadly. So Amazon, Google, Facebook will get firm power for their data centers, and they'll get the public to foot at least a portion of the bill. So I think concerns about rates and bills are only going to become more prominent. So I think that's the first factor that's leading people to think about alternatives to what we have. The second, of course, is climate and the reality that for all the growth of renewable energy, we're still not on track to get to net zero certainly by 2040 and even by 2050. And so if we really want to accelerate decarbonization, tax credits and regulatory mandates are not enough. We will need a major investment program. And my view is only the public sector has the means of delivering that sustained large-scale investment. Private sector investment is simply too fickle. I think about the IRA, the IRA.
Ah, yes. Let's talk about the IRA, because I was thinking that since you published this book, we've seen massive changes in U.S. energy politics. What does this mean in terms of your overall look at how we can move forward?
Yeah, so I view the IRA as a very positive stepping stone. The government is spending money to promote investment in clean energy, extending tax credits through 2032, making these tax credits available to tax-exempt entities like publicly owned utilities, cooperatives. There's a lot of good there. I think if you had asked me this question, 6 months ago, a few days before the presidential election, I would have said, yeah, the IRA is going to give public and cooperative power a real jolt in the arm. But now it's really unclear what's going to happen to all this money. It's been appropriated, it's law, but given what Trump and Musk are doing to the federal government, I'm a lot less confident. They're canceling government contracts left and right. They're canceling money that's been awarded. And so there's a real threat to the IRA. Will direct pay be a real option 6 months from now, 12 months from now?
Direct pay, let's explain what direct pay is.
Yeah, sure. So direct pay is the provision of the IRA that makes tax credits available to publicly owned utilities and cooperatives. Ordinarily, they're not eligible for tax credits because they don't have federal income tax liability. But what Congress did in the IRA is it said, going forward, these tax-exempt entities will be able to claim tax credits in the form of effectively a back-end grant. So let's say a publicly owned utility builds a solar farm that costs $1 billion. I'll just pick a nice round number. The public agency will be entitled to a production tax credit in the form of a direct payment equivalent to 30% of the cost of construction. So once the solar plant is up and running, the IRS will send a check to the public agency for $300 million. And so that's a significant amount of money, major carrot to promote clean energy investment. And now this entire program is under a cloud.
So my takeaway, though, is that there's still a strong case, and it's still a good time to be looking at public power for the first two reasons that you stated, which were rates are rising and two, the climate issue is becoming more crucial. However, because of the politics of today, because of the Inflation Reduction Act being in jeopardy, it may take a bit longer. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's right. And there are still real opportunities at the state and local level. Obviously, at the federal level, we're not going to see an expansion of public power in the next 4 years. That's not a real possibility. But at the state and local level, I think there are opportunities to not only defend existing institutions, but expand and strengthen existing institutions. So you mentioned the public renewables fight in New York. There will also be opportunities for municipalization campaigns. And in a sense, history gives me some hope. Even during the very conservative 1920s, a decade which has a number of parallels to our present decade, people were fighting for public power. They were launching municipalization campaigns, some successfully, and working toward what became the New Deal. So as bleak as national politics are at the moment, we should recognize we're playing the long game, and this is an opportunity to develop, refine a public power program, build coalitions, try to score wins at the state and local level, and be ready for when politics changes at the national level, which I suspect will happen sooner rather than later.
So patience and persistence.
Yes, exactly.
Great. Well, my last question, I want to tell people how to get your book. I got it through Amazon, but there are other ways to find your book as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the best way to purchase my book is to go directly to the University of Chicago Press, and I can share a discount code with your listeners. And
Very nice. Yes.
It is all caps DMCRCYPWR24.
Okay. If you're frantically looking for a pen, I'm going to put that in the show notes too, so you don't have to do that.
So with that code, you can save about $15 on the retail price. So the retail price is $45. With the code, you can get it for about $30.
Perfect. Very nice. Great. Well, hey, thank you so much, Sandeep. Appreciate you writing this book. Appreciate you coming on the Energy Changemakers podcast to talk to us about it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.